What secret does this game hide? TimeSplitters 2 is a curious case. This is a first-person shooter that came out for the PlayStation 2 in the year 2002, developed by Free Radical Design, a studio created by former members of Rare, the legendary creators of GoldenEye 007 and other games for the Nintendo 64. The game was acclaimed for its campaign mode, its precise controls, and above all, for its custom map editing system that allowed players to create their own levels, something quite revolutionary for its time. But what not many people know is that inside the game, buried deep in the files, there is something strange that most players never expected to discover. Most of the time, when a player fails a mission in TimeSplitters, a standard screen appears telling them that the mission failed, a frustrating moment. Players see that screen, listen to the background music, and usually press a button to continue. But what would happen if you simply stayed there waiting without doing anything? Well, if we do this, the music starts to change in ways that aren't normal. What begins as a standard background track transforms into something distorted. It starts playing extremely fast. Some players who discovered this described hearing fragmented dialogue, voice lines that seem to be processed through unusual sound effects. It turns out that these voices aren't random. Rather, they come from the character Kauchi, a character who appears in the Aztec Ruins level, but completely shattered, distorted, and modified to the point of being almost unrecognizable. But what really throws off anyone who discovers this is what happens after waiting for approximately 10 minutes. Suddenly, cutting completely through all the distortion and audio chaos, a clear, crisp, direct female voice appears saying a bit loud, which means un poco fuerte. Just that. A woman's voice saying that something is too loud, and then everything goes back to normal. When the player community began documenting and sharing this discovery, theories emerged about what it could mean. The most widely accepted explanation within the community is that it was simply an internal joke during the game's audio post-production. A sound engineer or audio editor likely made a spoken comment, and that comment was accidentally recorded into the final game files, and they found it funny to include it on the game over screen as a neat Easter egg. Something no one thought players would discover, because it requires a player to do something completely unnatural, stay completely still on a game over screen for over 10 minutes. Half-Life 2 is another classic case. Since its launch in 2004, the game's graphics engine, called the Source Engine, became the industry standard for years. This means that literally millions of people have spent time inside the game files, exploring how it works, how models are created, and how characters are animated. And in that process of exploration, the community discovered gameplay behaviors that occur when something goes wrong. Half-Life 2 is a game based on three-dimensional character models. Alex Vance, one of the most important characters in the story, is an animated 3D model. But what happens when one of these components disappears? What happens if you delete or corrupt Alex's 3D model file, but leave her voice lines and animations intact? The result is something the community describes as Ghost Alex. If you run Half-Life 2 with Alex's 3D model file deliberately deleted or corrupted, the game doesn't freeze, it doesn't crash, it doesn't pull a Rico and go kaboom! It simply continues as if nothing were wrong. Alex's artificial intelligence code keeps running. Her voice is still heard. The only thing missing from her is her body. What you see then is other characters interacting with nothingness. You can hear Alex speak her full dialogue lines, and her positioning suggests she's talking to someone specific in space, but there's nothing there, just there. Why does this happen?
Todavía tengo pesadillas con ese gato.
Venga, no hay razón para estar nerviosos.
¿Qué gato?
Hemos progresado mucho desde entonces. Grandes progresos.
¿Qué gato?
Ya que no va a salir, mejor que deje el atuendo de paisano.
¿Qué? Dios, es verdad, casi lo olvido. Barney, te cedo el honor.
Because the creators of Half-Life 2 built a game system so modular and segregated that each component can function independently. AI doesn't depend on a 3D model. Animations run even if there's nothing to visually animate. Voice is simply audio completely separate from the visual representation. So when you remove one piece, the rest of the system simply continues, as if it were still there. In the context of game design, it makes sense. The developers wanted their game to be robust, but the result is these moments of fractured reality where you see a world operating normally, but with a character completely absent. It's not a programming bug per se, but an unintended feature of the Source Engine's architecture. It requires someone to access the game files, edit or delete a specific file, and then run the game again. It was impossible for this to happen accidentally during normal gameplay. It was something that only someone deliberately investigating the internal game files could have found. I think part of what's amazing about all of this is how Half-Life 2's source engine was so adaptable. They could remove things and keep it running without any issues. It shows a bit of how truly incredible it is and the vast number of secrets this game hides, even 20 years later. Resident Evil 1.5 is another curious case. Capcom released a massive hit in 1998 that became one of the pillars of the horror franchise. But what many players don't know is that the game everyone played was not the first attempt. There existed a completely different version, so far along in development that it was nearly finished when Capcom decided to throw it in the trash and start from scratch. In 1996, the programmers, designers, and artists had built a game set in the same city of Raccoon City. There were bizarre and sinister creatures that didn't appear in the final version. Zombies that launched unpredictably, creatures that were half human, half spider. The overall atmosphere was wilder and more unpredictable. Basically, they were working on a version of Resident Evil 2 that, for many years, never saw the light of day. The team worked for months. They built levels, animated characters, and when they finally reached the point where they had a playable product, someone in Capcom management played it and decided it wasn't good enough. The version they had created, which had consumed months of hard work and resources, was considered mediocre and didn't meet the standards Capcom wanted for its sequel. So they made a radical decision. Scrap the first version of Resident Evil 2 entirely and start over from scratch. What's impressive is how fast they did it. The team remade Resident Evil 2 in a short amount of time, creating the version that was finally released in 1998. But in the chaos of rush production and the hurry to meet deadlines, the developers didn't have time to do a thorough cleanup of the storage drives where they kept their files. The data from the previous version was never completely deleted, it simply stayed there. Years later, when investigators began digging into the data files of Resident Evil 2, they discovered that the game everyone knew contained remnants of its cancelled predecessor. There were fragments of code, incomplete graphics, files, and 3D models of creatures that were never supposed to exist in the final version. It was like unearthing the bones of an early, discarded version of the game. What's fascinating is what happened next. A group of fans passionate about game preservation meticulously collected every code fragment they could find, and using their programming and design knowledge, they restored most of the cancelled version of Resident Evil 2, which was dubbed Resident Evil 1.5. The work was monumental. They didn't just have code fragments, but incomplete ones. Some files were corrupted, and some features were never fully implemented. So the modders had to do creative work, historical research, and reverse engineering to figure out what every piece of code was supposed to be. And they pulled it off. They rebuilt 95% of the cancelled game with enough functionality for it to be fully playable from start to finish. What's incredible is that all of this was done for free. The fans worked without financial compensation, without official recognition from Capcom, driven purely by the passion to preserve a piece of video game history that had been lost nearly 30 years ago. Nowadays, anyone with a computer can download Resident Evil 1.5 and experience the cancelled version of the game, complete with the weird zombies, human spider creatures, and all of that. For a game that was rejected for being mediocre, but represents a rescued piece of a classic game, it is undoubtedly incredible. This case reveals something important. Developers expected their failed work to disappear forever, for no one to ever discover what they had created, and yet what was discarded resurfaced. A reminder that on the internet, nothing truly disappears. Tell me, what did you think of these discoveries in games that we were never meant to find? Which other one was missing? Leave it in the comments.